Excellencies, lords, ladies, and gentlemen, can everyone please take a seat? I'm Karen von Hippel, the new Director General here at RUSI, and I'm delighted to welcome such a large gathering of friends, trustees, council members, RUSI members, and guests for RUSI's flagship event, which is the annual address by the Chief of the Defense Staff. As many of you know, RUSI has its roots in this country's armed forces, and the study of military sciences remains central to what we do here. In the past few years, RUSI has put increasing emphasis on problems that require a cross-government approach: cyber, organized crime, terrorism. Just as the latest SDSR, Strategic Defense and Security Review, reflects a government's desire to widen the scope of defense and security planning well beyond defense. But the core focus at RUSI is with the UK's armed forces and with the vital job they do protecting the UK's national security. RUSI will always be a friend to the armed forces, even if at times our experts may be critical of aspects of national defense policy and practice. In other words, we are an occasional critical friend, appreciative of the dilemmas that policymakers face on a day-to-day basis, even as we may encourage them to look at issues from a different angle. Speaking of friends, as my new colleagues inform me, there is no better friend to RUSI than the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Sir Nicholas Houghton. We are extremely grateful to Sir Nicholas for joining us this evening at RUSI to share his thoughts on British defense and international security. As many of you know, this will be Sir Nicholas's third and last address in this capacity at RUSI. We have plans for him for other capacities. You do have his biography in front of you, so I won't eat into precious time by reciting all the details, but I would like to mention just a few highlights, notably that he served as Senior British Military Representative and Deputy Commanding General of the multinational force in Iraq, and then subsequently as Chief of Joint Operations. He then served as Vice Chief of the Defense Staff in May 2009, where he was central to implementing the outcomes of the 2010 Strategic Defense and Security Review before assuming the current appointment as the CDS in July 2013. It will be interesting to hear perhaps later on his thoughts about how he was able to integrate what he learned from the 2010 review into the 2015 SDSR. Tonight's event is, of course, extremely timely, coming so soon after the publication of the 2015 SDSR and the recent decision in Parliament to join airstrikes in Syria. As is usual in these gatherings, the presentation by Sir Nicholas will be on the record, while the remarks made during the discussion will be off the record and not for attribution, commonly known as RUSI House rules. Excellencies, lords, ladies, and gentlemen, General Sir Nicholas Houghton.
Well, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, can I say how delighted I am to be back at RUSI for my third and, as you've heard, probably final CDS Christmas lecture. If I'm still here in 12 months' time, something has gone badly wrong with the succession planning, and I will need to relook at my holiday cancellation insurance cover. Karen, warmest of welcomes to RUSI and to your new appointment, and the very best of luck in it. I'm sure you'll thoroughly enjoy it, and as you say, RUSI has always been a very good friend to the armed forces. Now, inevitably in choosing a subject for tonight's talk, I thought that the outcome of the recent SDSR would inevitably dominate. But my working title for tonight is Interesting Times. It's not that I felt the need to try to draw a bigger audience with a seductive title. The audience tonight flatters me with its interest. But to me, Interesting Times captures the context in which the review was held. It's probably the best strategic forecast of what lies ahead, and I trust will encourage some wider questions once I've finished my on-the-record comments. But I also wanted to explain and exploit this opportunity to go beyond the capability headlines of the review and to give you a broader sense of what it means for defence and the armed forces, I think, over the coming years. As such, it is, at least in part, a self-reflection on my own future legacy. Now, just to start with a bit of context, the context for the review we have just completed was, in many respects, a challenging one. I think the challenge manifested itself, you can bracket it, but I would just offer 4 ways. First, was undoubtedly the complexity of the global strategic environment. An environment of greater danger, defined by increased instability and uncertainty, by a wider and more diverse range of threats, many of which were now more patent than latent, and by ever greater complexity in the nature of the relationships between countries, and which now sees, I think, a far greater diffusion of the ways in which power interacts. It's a far more difficult context in which to identify friend from foe, war from peace, or to properly situate the utility of military force. I think the second bit of context was the enduring aftermath of the global economic crisis, which had led many countries to reduce defence expenditure and which prompted the reaffirming 15 months ago at the NATO summit in South Wales of the NATO benchmark target of 2% of GDP for defence expenditure, a target that even 6 months the new government had not yet formally recommitted to. It never went below, but hadn't at that stage formally recommitted. Then the third bit of context I sense was probably a broader questioning still of the enduring utility of much of the conventional arsenals of Western countries, a sense among some of the commentators of the declining relevance of hard power in the context of the threats of the moment. And then I think fourth, I would say, the last bit of context, was a parliamentary and a wider societal unease born of the experiences of Iraq and to some extent Afghanistan with regard to the beneficial utility of armed force, particularly when used at strategic distance in culturally alien places with uncertain strategic outcomes. A common line I have used over the past few years is that the British Armed Forces have never been held in higher public esteem, but the purposes to which we have most recently been put has never been more deeply questioned. Now, from that unpromising context, but maybe partly because of it, I think that the Defence Review has delivered a remarkably good outcome. The UK has looked itself in the mirror and decided that it needed to do better. I think the first concrete sign of that was the political commitment last July in the summer budget to sustaining the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defence. That commitment alone meant that our Defence Review was going to be about betterment and not decline. But taken together with the earlier commitments to continuous at-sea deterrence, to bringing both carriers into operational use, and to sustaining the levels of military manpower, there was amongst the military a growing confidence that the UK government was committed to retaining a global role, to reasserting its strategic authority, and more widely, to recognising the need to respond to a security context more replete with risk. So, as I say, the outcome of the review itself was, I believe, a very good one. It has, I know, been very well received by many, if not most, of our allies. It's one in which there was considerable input from outside government. It saw unprecedented levels of mutual cooperation amongst close partners in its preparation, and we were hugely grateful for that. Specifically, the review broke old custom and new ground by presenting the defence dimension of security as an integrated part of a national strategy serving national strategic objectives. In this respect, it was not narrowly a defence white paper, and that's a sort of a methodology and an outcome I consider wholly appropriate to the complex challenges we face. From a pure defence perspective, I think that perhaps inevitably the financial and capability aspects of the review stole many of the immediate headlines. In capability terms, the review has allowed us to lift our level of equipment investment to £178 billion over the next 10 years, and this in turn will allow us to plug many of the capability gaps that had worried us, as well as investing in new capabilities. And let me just very quickly, because it's not what I want to particularly talk about, is just summarise the main capability choices that we've made. I'll do this in areas. The first area I would emphasise is a range of capability that sits under the proponency of Joint Forces Command, which 5 years ago didn't exist. Primarily, this is C4ISR, Special Forces and cyber-related capabilities, a significant increase in UAVs, 20 UK-certified MQ-9 Reapers, which we will call protectors, a £2 billion investment for SF enablement, special force enablement, particularly strategic insertion. Additionally, what we call shadow ISR aircraft, a new high-altitude, long-endurance UAV capability, much more modern CIS standardized across defence, a new joint cyber and electromagnetic activities group. Taken together with our ability to sustain a whole range of ISR capability bought as UORs for Afghanistan, this package significantly enhances counter-terrorist strike capability and improves the intelligence and understand function of more conventional operations. The second area I would emphasise is maritime power projection. We've been able to formalise the commitment to operate both carriers, so at least one will be availability 100% of the time. We can now procure the afloat support shipping for the whole of the maritime enterprise. We can accelerate the purchase of F-35Bs into the early 2020s, and we will now buy 9 P-8 maritime patrol aircraft to make good one of the most concerning capability gaps of the last review. Taken together with the commitment to the Type 26 ASW frigate, this really does represent a renaissance in maritime power projection. And just finally, the third area I would stress in capability terms is the further investment in hard power. Here I would start with the commitment to nuclear deterrence through CASD, the commitment to 138 F-35Bs in the lifetime of the JSF programme, the generation of 2 additional Typhoon squadrons, a refocusing of the Army back on the divisional level of command and manoeuvre, the upgrade of our Apache and Chinook helicopter fleets, our investment in NATO's ballistic missile defence architecture, and our ambition to set the deployable joint force 2025 at 50,000 servicemen and women, signifying, I hope, a clean break from an army previously optimised for enduring campaigns at the brigade level. I would say that the capabilities we have made, the choices, have not been random, nor were they, something of a novelty you might think, designed to accommodate single service interest or lobby group pressure, of which there was in fact relatively little. They were made in the context of assessing, ameliorating and tolerating risk. I think that in a dangerous world, an appreciation of risk and its management over time is the only sensible gearing mechanism to make difficult choices possible when resources are finite. But the choices were a careful balance of counter-terrorist capability, hard power investment, and a clear recalibration to better meet some of the more diverse challenges of the age. But as I said at the start, I don't want to present the outcome of the review to you in the simplistic terminology of equipment types and manpower numbers. After all, this is a think tank, not an arms convention, and I'm a soldier, not a salesman. Rather, I want to offer you 5 themes which I think better demonstrate, if I could be so bold, the sophistication of the review's outcome and how we envisage the character of the future force and the defence organisation that generates it. They are utility, agility, strategy, innovation and partnership. These, I think, are at least some of the distinctive themes of the review, and I think they will probably need the greatest levels of energy, of leadership, of rigour and custodianship to realise. Collectively, they are at least part of the response that I would make to the consistent and I fear sometimes unimaginative criticism of those who can only judge the competence and capability of armed forces through the input metric of platform and manpower numbers. And again, I have not selected these themes randomly. I've chosen them because each in their own way represent a part of the strategic response to the bespoke security challenges of the age. So my first theme is utility. And indeed, our security review demands that our forces have greater utility. A small diversion. In a typical UK way, we have been spending much of this year, and dare I say it last and next, in historic commemoration. This year, the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, Gallipoli, 1915, the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Such national events, when coupled with the recent experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, burn, I think, into the public psyche the false idea that armed forces are predominantly about fighting wars. But in truth, armed forces should be much more about avoiding, preventing and deterring war, maintaining the stability of the world order so as to permit the exploitation of opportunity in pursuit of prosperity, whilst mitigating those recurring threats and security-related crises, which are, I think, the inevitable byproduct of a world in which so many nations feel denied their sense of historic entitlement. So as a nation, we should better imagine ourselves being in a permanent state of competition, constantly striving to retain or improve our comparative advantage in a challenging world. This, to me, is the context of the moment, and it's going to persist and, I fear, intensify. So the review reimagines the utility of the UK's armed forces to a considerable extent. Instead of seeing them in the simple construct of either fighting wars or preparing for the next one, we intend to make more productive use of their wide utility. So in future, our armed forces will provide an increased contribution to countering terrorism and building stability overseas. We'll work in an integrated way with intelligence agencies, police and the Home Office more closely than ever before, including domestically, but also building capacity to strike at terrorists globally before they can attack us, and also building our partners' capabilities so that they can better deal with terrorism, radicalisation and extremism. There's a commitment to play a greater role in UN peacekeeping missions, for example, Somalia and South Sudan, in bolstering targeted capacity building, specifically in Nigeria, and making our physical commitment more enduring in parts of the world, for example, the Gulf region. Now, many here will say that non-warfighting tasks have always been features of what our armed forces have done, and to an extent that is, of course, true. But they have never been organised as a strategic endeavour in the context of achieving our most national vital interests, which have to be security and prosperity, or at least not for some time have they been so organised. And critically, the active demonstration of our increased utility and capability will also enhance our deterrent value. After all, if a nation's assumed willingness to commit to the use of force is only ever in the face of national survival, then we risk encouraging rather than deterring revisionist states and their own ambitions. My second theme is agility. In order to service the demands of greater utility, we also need to be more agile. We need an agility of mind, of structure, and of capability. We need this in order to manage the diversity of threats we face, from existential to insidious, from state-sponsored asymmetry, the hybrid or new age warfare of Russia, to the sort of abhorrent terrorism we saw in Paris and Mali, from the threat of mass migration to the emerging threats of cyber war. So what we're calling Joint Force 2025 will require both flexibility and agility to operate across the domains of threat diversity. At one end of the scale, we will need the demonstrable ability to deal with large-scale conflict in order to fight or deter the most demanding scenarios. Hence, a potent expeditionary force of around 50,000 personnel based on a land division, a maritime task group, and an expeditionary air group, and a better considered methodology for regeneration. But within that force structure, we also need to be able to deploy more quickly to manage a greater variety of threats or crises at smaller scale. What the last few years has shown us is that governments increasingly want to have military options to a wide range of problems, both domestic and international. Not only are the military the security managers of last resort, they are often the first port of call for international rescue and domestic crisis. Whether it's fighting Ebola, guarding the Olympics, providing options for multiple terrorist attacks domestically, or searching for downed aircraft, governments want military options and they need them quickly. So the force structure has to have inherent agility, the ability to meet multiple concurrency, whilst being able to concentrate to generate capability at genuine scale. This inherent requirement for agility of employment, I think, will place significant demands on training, leadership and force generation. But the force structure has to be more productive than simply being contingent. And I also believe that the force structure needs to be able to draw on a far more diverse set of skills and competencies, many of which are not found in people who would ordinarily volunteer for the rigours of military service. Hence, we need to be a lot more sophisticated on how we use reserves and contractors to bring wider skills to the whole force. And in this context, we plan to review the nature and flexibility of the terms and conditions of military service that we offer to the next generation of servicemen and women. My third theme, dangerous one in this company, is strategic. This, for my purposes tonight, is shorthand for an understanding that, more often than not, even the most modest use of military capability sits in a strategic context, and we increasingly need to accept that most of the threats we face cannot be resolved by military action alone, certainly not decisively. The idea that there are elements of military activity, for example, the domain of operational art, which can remain hermetically sealed from wider government engagement and involvement, to me does not survive close scrutiny. Terrorism, hybrid war, compound threats, war in the information age all require sophisticated all-of-government approaches. Military activity has to be concerted with all the levers of national power at the strategic level. Sometimes economic sanctions will be better at coercive effect than military deployments. Diplomacy, development aid, and strategic information must all be harmonised in a national and regional strategies that promote security, national interest, and prosperity. We must better recognise the power of a potent narrative. In the information age, almost all acts of physical violence come with an online component, exploiting social networks to manipulate opinion and perception. The tactics employed by Russia in Ukraine, Estonia, Georgia, for example, include combinations of information warfare, cyber activity, counterintelligence, espionage, economic warfare, and the sponsorship of proxies. Daesh, or ISIL, uses Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in 23 different languages to prosecute its narrative. And our adversaries can act unconstrained by Western policy, ethical, and legal codes to exploit and assault our vulnerabilities. So across government, we need to organise ever better to provide a harmonised response to the threats we face and the techniques of the age, and not always simply a response, but a proactive element as well. The review seeks to help provide that comprehensive instrument of full spectrum effects and capabilities. As I read through this script, I just wanted to re-emphasise this point about the strategic harmonisation. I fear that at the moment, full spectrum effects are in truth just fascinating accessories to conventional military approaches. We need to change this so they are central to our way of doing business at national level. My fourth theme is that of innovation. The exponential advance and proliferation of technology now allows nations to develop anti-access and area denial capabilities which threaten our technical advantage. We must have disruptive technologies to counter such threats. More widely, only through technical innovation which properly harnesses the potential of robotics, microprocessing, novel materials, and unmanned flight, to name but the most obvious, will we be able to maintain a technical advantage. So the review sees us shifting capabilities into new areas: special forces, cyber defence and offence, intelligence now increasingly based on the exploitation of big data and social media. We will continue to prioritise science and technology by maintaining investment at a minimum of 1.2% of the defence budget. We will also draw on expertise from private and academic sectors to develop new, potentially game-changing technologies, and we have found room to allocate £800 million of new money purely for innovative propositions, ones which are truly transformative and which offer us the possibility of delivering future military capabilities in radically more effective and efficient ways. Maintaining a decisive edge while starting to break us out of the simple pattern of life cycle replacement and capability emulation, a pattern we have followed for far too long. But of course, our approach to innovation must be more than just technical. We also need to transform the culture of defence itself in a variety of ways, making it more agile and adaptive, and helping to develop the talents of our people in the practical exploitation of science and technology. And importantly, as I mentioned earlier, finding ways to bring a greater range of talented and innovative individuals to the service of the nation. I say this because I want the armed forces to be an exemplar of diversity and inclusivity. But I want this not simply for its own sake, but so that we can exploit the talent of all elements of society. So, for example, our innovative instinct should embrace new understanding, such as the wider UK work as a global leader on women, peace and security. The review highlighted that this work will continue to be a priority for the government, and so Defence will continue its investment in this area over the coming years. After all, armed forces and armed conflicts around the world create a wave of destruction impacting on the lives of innocent civilians, often disproportionately affecting women and children, and sexual violence is still a commonly used weapon of war. So we're actively reviewing doctrine and policy to ensure that women, peace and security principles are embedded at every level of operational planning and implementation. We're reviewing basic and pre-deployment training to ensure that it is effective. And we are building on our pool of gender expertise. We need to use the skills, experience and knowledge of women in novel ways to resolve and prevent conflict. And we've already deployed gender advisors and experts through our overseas training establishments to deliver relevant training in Iraq, Afghanistan and numerous countries in Africa. So innovation will become part of Defence's culture in all that we do. My final theme is partnership. If so far this has all sounded a bit too self-confident and hubristic, can I now inject a huge amount of humility? The review recognises that there is only so much security that any one nation can achieve alone. The importance of achieving collective security through alliances remains vital, particularly to any enterprise that needs to be conducted at scale. Partnerships are fundamental to our ability to manage security risk in a context in which we cannot afford a national inventory to face all threats, particularly if one of those threats is a more general challenge to the rules-based world as we know it. In the past, the UK has been what you might describe as international by instinct. We did it because we'd always done it that way, but there was not always a clear strategy behind it. Now we plan to be international by design. So our review reaffirms that NATO remains at the heart of British defence, not just through the 2% GDP commitment, but through contributions, for example, for the enhanced NATO response force, and more widely as we make our capability choices. We're at the heart of NATO's Readiness Action Plan to improve both reassurance and deterrence, recognising that deterrence has to deal with a more hybrid threat. We're also committed to other multinational arrangements. We've recently signed a memorandum of understanding with our Baltic, Danish, Dutch and Norwegian friends for them to be an integral part of our national joint expeditionary force, the force which is the foundation of UK's return to contingency. Separately, in the Gulf region, we're committed to developing a series of permanent bases, for example, our naval base in Bahrain, in order to enhance the wider support and reassurance that we can give that region. And our bilateral relationships are as close as ever. With France, we have just completed the initial validation phase of the combined joint expeditionary force. And with the Americans, we continue to share a remarkable, intimate military relationship. It's in equipment, technology, innovation, nuclear development, special forces, intelligence, and increasingly now, cooperation in the global alignment of force deployments, particularly in the maritime domain and in the allocation of precious ISR resources. Well, I think I've probably said enough. What I wanted to achieve is a shared understanding that the review was to defence and the armed forces far more than an opportunity to spend more money on kit. There is logic to our capability choices, and they will influence future force development. But the more fundamental implications of the review on the armed forces, if properly managed, are on the character of the force. It is a future force of greater utility and agility, one that being integrated into a national endeavour is more routinely strategic in purpose, and it's a future force which aspires to be innovative in nature and international by design. So by way of conclusion, the National Security Strategy and the SDSR acted in combination and an are appropriate response, I think, to what I consider the grand strategic security challenge of the age. That is, how to accommodate the change which is inevitable whilst maintaining stability. The stability from which we derive our international authority, our relative prosperity, and sustain our wonderful open society. And to do so at a time of ever more diverse threats and ever greater complexity in international relations. The review is not a panacea, but it does offer a blueprint for how the United Kingdom aspires to retain national advantage in a competitive and dangerous world. And we have recognised we cannot do it alone, by chance, nor through the simple evolution of previous capability and practice. The interesting times which form the context for the review are undoubtedly set to continue. There is simply too much change in the world, born of demographic, economic, and societal challenge to the status quo. But let me just finish with the other element of interesting times which undoubtedly formed part of the context for the review. This was the wholly appropriate and far greater questioning by Parliament and society of the utility of military force in managing the security challenges of the age. We have been reminded that in the most developed of democracies there is inevitably a far greater challenge to the utility and therefore the employment of force, and it certainly cannot be taken as a given. I believe, therefore, that we have a strong public duty to help educate and inform our society that the freedoms we enjoy are not a free good. We constantly need to protect them, to project our influence to help preserve them and enhance them, and by being prepared to fight for them, hope that we don't have to, at least too often. So thank you all very much. A heartfelt thank you for all who work in defence, and as quiet a Christmas as you deserve.